My husband emptied our accounts for his girlfriend while I was away caring for my dying mother. He thought he'd left me with nothing. But when my lawyer revealed my hidden assets at the divorce hearing, Edward's face turned white as he realized I'd secretly been one step ahead all along. The courtroom fell silent as I watched Edward stare at the financial documents my lawyer had just placed before him. His attorney leaned over, whispering urgently in his ear, but Edward wasn't listening. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His eyes were fixed on the papers, scanning the figures again and again, as if hoping they might somehow change if he looked at them long enough. I had expected anger. I had anticipated outrage, perhaps even a dramatic outburst. Edward had always been theatrical when cornered. But what I saw instead was something I hadn't seen in his eyes for years. Fear. It was subtle at first, just a momentary widening of the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. But as he continued reading, the blood drained from his face. His hands, those confident hands that had once held mine with such conviction, now trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the documents. This can't be right, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. My lawyer, Dominique Rivera, stood beside me, composed and elegant in her tailored suit. She had warned me this would happen. This moment when Edward would realize that his carefully orchestrated plan to leave me destitute had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly. I assure you, Mr. Blackwell, every figure in those documents is accurate, Dominique replied, her voice steady and uncompromising. As you can see, my client has maintained separate accounts and investments that predate your marriage. Accounts you were never authorized to access. 3 months ago, I had returned from my mother's bedside to discover our joint accounts emptied, our investment portfolio liquidated, and our safety deposit box cleared out. Edward had planned his exit meticulously, timing it perfectly with my absence. He had believed I would be too devastated by my mother's death, too emotionally fractured to fight back. He had been wrong. Now, watching him across the conference table, I felt no satisfaction, no vindictive pleasure. What I felt was something quieter, more profound, a sense of reclamation, of taking back not just financial security, but dignity. How did you do this? Edward asked, looking up at me directly for the first time since the meeting had begun. His voice held a note of genuine bewilderment, as if he couldn't reconcile the woman sitting before him with the one he thought he had married. The one he thought he could control. I didn't answer immediately. How could I explain that his betrayal hadn't shocked me as much as it should have? That somewhere, buried beneath years of compromise and self-doubt, I had always known this day might come. You taught me well, Edward, I finally said, my voice softer than I'd intended. You always said I should pay attention to the details. Muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign that my words had landed. For years, he had belittled my interest in our finances, had dismissed my questions about our investments as naive, had patted my hand condescendingly whenever I'd asked about our retirement plans. Elizabeth will handle that, he'd tell his colleagues at dinner parties, with that charming laugh that had once made my heart flutter. She's more interested in her charities than boring financial talk. Those charities. The work he had dismissed, as mere hobbies, as diversions to keep me occupied while he built his empire. The very work that had connected me to Quinn Rodriguez, my cousin, a brilliant criminal lawyer who had first noticed the discrepancies in Edward's business dealings, who had gently suggested I might want to protect myself. Your wife has substantial assets that were never commingled with marital property, Dominique continued, addressing Edward's lawyer rather than him. Assets that have been carefully and legally maintained as separate property throughout the marriage. Edward's attorney, a sharp-faced man named Ashton Pierce, flipped through the documents with increasing agitation. This should have been disclosed. During discovery? He snapped, but there was no real confidence behind his protest. Everything was properly disclosed, Dominique replied smoothly. Perhaps you missed it in the documentation we provided last month. Page 37, if I recall correctly. It was a perfectly executed legal maneuver, burying the explosive information in a mountain of paperwork, knowing Edward and his attorney would skim over it, confident that they already knew the full extent of our financial situation. Edward looked at me again, his expression hardening. You planned this, he said, not a question but an accusation. All this time, you were planning this. The irony of his accusation wasn't lost on me. Edward, who had meticulously planned to drain our accounts while I sat at my dying mother's bedside. Edward, who had already signed a lease on a new apartment for himself and Kenna, his 27-year-old girlfriend from the marketing department. Edward, who had moved his most valuable possessions out of our home piece by piece over the course of months, thinking I wouldn't notice. No, Edward, I replied, maintaining eye contact despite the urge to look away. I was planning our future. You were planning your escape. His face flushed at that, the paleness giving way to an angry red that crept up his neck. I had seen that look before, when deals fell through, when subordinates challenged him, when the world refused to bend to his will. Once that look had made me retreat, eager to soothe, to placate. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. Edward had never seen me as a partner, only as a possession. Miss Blackwell has been more than generous in her settlement offer, Dominique interjected, sliding another document across the table. Given the circumstances, I suggest you review it carefully. The circumstances she referred to so delicately were the fruits of Quinn's investigation. The offshore accounts, the questionable business partnerships, the creative accounting that had kept Edward's less savory dealings hidden from his firm's partners. Information that could destroy not just his finances, but his reputation, his career, his carefully constructed image. Information that I had no desire to use unless forced. Edward understood immediately, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the settlement terms that would leave him with his career intact, with enough to start over, but nothing close to the fortune he had tried to steal from me. This is blackmail, he hissed, pushing the paper away. This is mercy, I corrected him quietly. The conference room felt suddenly too small, too airless. Outside, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city stretching out beneath a clear autumn sky. The same city where Edward and I had once walked hand in hand, planning a future together, dreaming of the life we would build. 12 years of marriage collapsed into a stack of legal documents and barely restrained hostility. Ashton leaned over to whisper in Edward's ear again, more urgently this time. I could see the calculation in Edward's eyes, the rapid assessment of options, the growing recognition that he had no leverage here. The man who had always prided himself on being 3 steps ahead of everyone else had been outmaneuvered. We'll need time to review these terms, Ashton finally said, gathering the papers with deliberate slowness. Of course, Dominique replied, but I should inform you that our offer expires in 48 hours. After that, we'll be preparing for trial, with all that entails. The threat was clear, and from the way Edward's shoulders tensed, I knew he understood. A trial would mean public disclosure, would mean his partners at the firm finding out exactly what he had been doing behind their backs, would mean Kenna discovering that the wealthy, powerful man she had hitched her wagon to might soon be neither. As Xiao. They stood to leave. Edward paused, his hand on the back of his chair. For a moment, I thought I saw something like regret flicker across his face. Not for what he had done, but for the miscalculation that had led us here. You've changed, he said, and I couldn't tell if it was an accusation or a realization. No, I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I've always been this person. You just never bothered to look. After they left, Dominique turned to me, her professional demeanor softening slightly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You did well," she said, squeezing my arm gently. "He'll sign. Men like Edward always choose self-preservation in the end." I nodded, gathering my own papers, trying to process the swirl of emotions. Relief that the confrontation was over. Sadness for what had been lost. But primarily a strange, quiet sense of liberation, not just from Edward, but from the version of myself I had allowed him to define. As we walked out of the conference room, Dominique checked her watch. "I have another meeting, but we should celebrate this. Dinner next week?" "I'd like that," I said, managing a small smile. In the elevator, descending from the 40th floor of the gleaming office tower, I caught my reflection in the polished doors. A woman I was still getting to know. Stronger than I had realized. More resilient than Edward had ever given me credit for. The woman who had sat at her mother's bedside, holding her hand through those final, painful weeks, while simultaneously discovering that her husband was emptying their accounts. The woman who had not fallen apart, but had instead made a single phone call to her cousin Quinn, setting in motion the events that had led to today's meeting. The woman who was now, for the first time in over a decade, truly free. The elevator doors opened to the marble-floored lobby, and I stepped out into my new life, the weight of the past dropping away with each step. Edward had wanted to leave, me with nothing. Instead, he had inadvertently given me the one thing I needed most, the chance to rediscover who I really was, beneath all the compromises and accommodations of our marriage. As I pushed through the revolving doors into the crisp, autumn air, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Edward, not of being alone, not of the future stretching before me, uncharted but filled with possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. I never imagined my life would take such a dramatic turn at 43. Standing outside that law firm, I felt like I was emerging from a long hibernation, disoriented but oddly energized, blinking in the sudden brightness of a world I'd stopped truly seeing years ago. The walk back to my apartment took me past the elegant storefronts of Fifth Avenue, where Edward and I had once shopped for anniversary gifts, past the little Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated promotions and birthdays, past all the landmarks of a marriage I was now dismantling piece by piece. It was strange how the city remained unchanged while my life had been completely upended. My phone buzzed in my purse, Quinn checking in, as he had done almost daily since I'd returned from my mother's bedside to find our accounts emptied. "How did it go?" His text read, direct and to the point. That was Quinn. No unnecessary words, no dramatic flourishes. Just the steady, unwavering support that had been my lifeline these past months. "Better than expected," I typed back. Edward looked like he'd seen a ghost. 3 dots appeared immediately, then, "Good. He deserves worse." Quinn had always been protective of me, even when we were children growing up next door to each other in a quiet Connecticut suburb. But his protectiveness had taken on a new dimension when he'd become a criminal defense attorney, as if the daily exposure to human treachery had only intensified his desire to shield those he loved from harm. It was Quinn who had first noticed something off about Edward's business dealings, who had gently suggested over dinner 3 years ago that I might want to establish some financial independence. At the time, I'd dismissed his concerns as professional paranoia, the natural suspicion of a man who spent his days defending clients against the consequences of their worst decisions. Edward would never do anything to hurt me, I'd insisted, and Quinn had let it drop, though the concern never quite left his eyes. How differently things might have turned out if I'd listened then, if I'd recognized the warning signs that, in retrospect, had been flashing like neon. The late nights that grew more frequent, the business trips that extended without explanation, the growing impatience with my questions about our finances, the subtle shifts in how he spoke to me, looked at me, touched me, as if I were becoming a stranger in my own marriage, but I hadn't wanted to see. It had been easier to immerse myself in my volunteer work with the Children's Literacy Foundation, to focus on caring for my increasingly frail mother, to pretend that the growing distance between Edward and me was just a phase, just the natural evolution of a long marriage. My apartment building came into view. Not the expansive penthouse Edward and I had shared for 9 years, but a smaller, elegant pre-war building I'd purchased quietly last year when my mother's health had begun to fail. I'd told Edward it was an investment property, a place to generate rental income, and he'd been so disinterested in what he called my little project that he hadn't even asked to see it. That disinterest had been my salvation. The apartment had become a sanctuary during my mother's illness, a place where I could retreat when the sterile hospital rooms and the relentless march of her disease became too much to bear. A place that was mine alone, untouched by Edward's influence. And now, it was my home. The only home I had left after Edward had changed the locks on our penthouse the day after I'd returned from my mother's funeral to find our accounts empty. "Is Mrs. Blackwell back from her travels?" the doorman asked with a warm smile as he held the door for me. I'd maintained the fiction that I was simply using the apartment occasionally while my main residence was being renovated. A necessary deception then, but one I could soon abandon. "Yes, Frank. I'm back for good now," I replied, returning his smile with the first genuine one I'd managed all day. The elevator carried me to the 8th floor, and as I unlocked my door, I was greeted by the faint scent of the lilies Quinn had sent to brighten the place. They were beginning to fade now, the edges of the petals turning brown. But I hadn't had the heart to throw them out. They were the first gift I'd received after my mother's death that hadn't been accompanied by pitying looks or awkward condolences. I slipped off my heels and padded across the hardwood floors to the kitchen, where I poured myself a glass of the Cabernet that Quinn kept me supplied with, knowing it was the one small luxury I allowed myself these days. As I took the first sip, my phone rang, Dominique's name flashing on the screen. "Elizabeth? I've just heard from Ashton. Edward wants to meet. Just the two of you, no lawyers. Tomorrow morning." I nearly dropped my glass. "What? Why would he want that?" "My guess? He's hoping to appeal to your emotions. To get a better deal than what we've offered." Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the concern underneath. "You don't have to do this. In fact, I'd advise against it." I moved to the window, looking out at the slice of Central Park visible between the buildings. Autumn had turned the trees to flame, red and gold against the darkening sky. My mother had loved this time of year. "The world putting on its finest show before winter," she'd called it. "I'll meet with him," I heard myself say, surprising both Dominique and myself. "Elizabeth, are you sure? He can be persuasive. And you've been through a lot these past few months." She wasn't wrong. Edward's charm had been his greatest asset in business and in life. That ability to make you feel like the most important person in the room, to make you believe that your happiness was his only concern. It had taken me years to recognize it for what it was. Not genuine connection, but calculated manipulation. A tool he deployed precisely when it served his interests. "I'm sure," I said more firmly this time. "I need to do this, for closure, if nothing else." After a moment's hesitation, Dominique sighed. "All right, but call me immediately afterward. And remember, don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. This is just a conversation." After we hung up, I remained by the window, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sky. Why did Edward want to see me? What did he hope to gain? The Edward I knew, or thought I knew, was not a man who admitted defeat gracefully. He would have some angle, some strategy to turn the situation to his advantage. For 12 years, I'd been married to a man who approached every interaction as a negotiation, every relationship as a transaction. I'd watched him charm and manipulate, his way through boardrooms and dinner parties alike, always calculating his advantage, always 3 moves ahead in a game only he seemed to be playing. But that was before. Before I'd found the courage to stand up for myself. Before I'd discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. Before I'd learned that the greatest power comes not from controlling others, but from knowing your own worth. My phone buzzed again, another text from Quinn. Mary just told me about Edward's request. Bad idea. He's desperate and cornered. Mary was Quinn's wife, a family court judge whose quiet wisdom had been another source of strength for me. Of course she would have heard about the meeting from her courthouse connections. News traveled fast in legal circles. I'll be fine, I texted back. I need to look him in the eye one last time. Quinn's response was immediate. Not alone. I'm coming with you. I smiled despite myself. Quinn, with his protective instincts, still trying to shield me from harm just as he had when we were children, and he'd stood up to the neighborhood bullies on my behalf. You can wait outside, I compromised. But this is something I need to do, myself. As I set my phone down, my gaze fell on the photograph beside it. My mother and me at the Literacy Foundation's fundraiser last year, her arm around my waist, both of us laughing at something off camera. It was the last event she'd been well enough to attend, though neither of us had known it at the time. You're stronger than you think, Lizzie, she'd told me that night as we shared a cab home. You always have been. You just need to believe it. I hadn't understood what she meant then. I'd thought my life was settled, secure, a successful husband, meaningful volunteer work, a wide circle of friends. What more could I need? Now standing in an apartment Edward knew nothing about, preparing to face him with the full knowledge of his betrayal, I finally understood. Strength wasn't about having everything under control. It was about facing the unknown with courage. It was about standing your ground when the foundations crumbled beneath you. My mother had seen what I couldn't, that beneath the polished surface of my marriage, beneath the social events and charity galas and perfectly curated vacations, I had slowly been disappearing. Not all at once, but in small concessions, in quiet compromises, in the gradual surrender of my own desires and opinions in favor of keeping the peace. Tomorrow, I would face Edward not as the accommodating wife he expected, but as the woman I was becoming, a woman who had survived loss and betrayal and emerged not broken, but transformed. I finished my wine and moved away from the window, from the fading light and gathering shadows. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own tests of resolve. But for tonight, in this space that was mine alone, I would rest. I would prepare. And I would remember that while Edward had taken much from me, he hadn't taken everything. Not my dignity. Not my resilience. And certainly not my future. The day before my meeting with Edward, I found myself standing in the small study of my apartment, staring at the photographs that lined the built-in bookshelf. There were dozens of them, carefully curated snapshots, of the life I had built with Edward over 12 years. Our wedding day, faces flushed with champagne and promise. Vacations on sun-drenched beaches and snow-capped mountains. Charity galas where we'd smiled for the society photographers, the perfect power couple. I had brought these photos with me when I moved to this apartment, telling myself I needed time to sort through them, to decide which memories were worth preserving. But in truth, I hadn't been ready to dismantle the visual evidence of my marriage, to admit that the story those photographs told had been, in many ways, a carefully constructed fiction. Now, with the reality of Edward's betrayal fully exposed, I could see these images for what they truly were, artifacts from a relationship that had been unraveling long before I was willing to acknowledge it. In photo after photo, I searched our expressions, our body language, looking for signs I had missed. When had his smile become performance rather than genuine joy? When had my eyes begun to hold that faint shadow of uncertainty? I took one frame, from the shelf, a candid shot taken at my mother's 70th birthday celebration 3 years ago. In it, Edward stood slightly apart from the family group, checking his phone while everyone else laughed at something my mother had said. I hadn't noticed it at the time or had chosen not to. Now it seemed painfully obvious. He had always been separate, always partially absent, even when physically present. My phone rang, startling me from my reverie. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Elizabeth Blackwell?" a woman's voice asked when I answered. "Yes, this is she. My name is Kenna Rutherford. I think we should talk." My heart lurched at the name. Edward's girlfriend. The woman for whom he had emptied our accounts and abandoned our marriage. The woman I had never met but whose existence had shattered the foundations of my life. "I don't think we have anything to discuss," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Please," she said, and something in her tone made me pause. Not defiance or hostility, but a kind of desperate earnestness. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. I should have hung up, should have maintained the clear boundary between my imploding marriage and this stranger who had played a role in its destruction. But curiosity, or perhaps some deeper need to understand, made me ask, "How did you get my number?" "From Edward's phone," she admitted. "He doesn't know I'm calling. Look, I'm at the coffee shop on 73rd and Madison. I can be there for another hour. Please just hear me out." After she hung up, I stood motionless, the photograph still in my hand. What could Kenna possibly want from me? Was this some strategy Edward had orchestrated, sending his girlfriend to soften me up before our meeting? Or was something else happening? Something I couldn't anticipate from my limited understanding of their relationship. 30 minutes later, driven by a need for answers that overrode my better judgment, I found myself pushing open the door to the coffee shop. It was late afternoon, the place half empty, making it easy to spot her. A slender woman with honey blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and an oversized sweater that made her look even younger than her 27 years. She saw me immediately, her eyes widening with recognition, though we had never met. As I approached her table, I could see she was nervous, fingers fidgeting with her coffee cup, posture tense with anticipation. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. Up close, she was prettier than I had imagined, but there was a vulnerability to her features that surprised me. I had pictured someone more polished, more obviously Edward's type. 5 minutes, I reminded her, not removing my coat. Kenna nodded, drawing a deep breath as if gathering courage. "I need to tell you something about Edward, something I don't think you know." "I think I know plenty," I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Her eyes met mine directly. "Do you know he's done this before? That I'm not the first?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" Before me, there was Caroline from accounting, and before her, Melissa from legal. She spoke quickly, as if afraid. I would leave before she could finish. "It's a pattern with him. He pursues women at the office, makes them feel special, convinces them they're different from all the others. When things start getting complicated, he moves on." I wanted to dismiss her words as lies, as manipulation. But they resonated with a truth I had been avoiding. Those unexplained late nights, those business trips that seemed to multiply, the emotional distance that had grown year by year. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Kenna looked down at her coffee cup, then back at me. "Because he's lying to us both, to you about me, and to me about you." She hesitated, then continued. "He told me your marriage was over in all but name, that you were staying together for appearances, for your social standing, that you had your own arrangements." The audacity of Edward's lies was breathtaking. Even as he'd drained our accounts, even as he'd planned his escape, he had constructed a narrative that allowed him to play the victim, the misunderstood husband trapped in a loveless marriage. "And now?" I asked, studying her face. "Now that you know the truth? Now I'm trying to figure out how to extricate myself from a man who turns out to be nothing like I thought." Her voice held a weariness beyond her years. "He's changed since you filed for divorce. He's angry all the time, controlling. I'm starting to see sides of him I never knew existed." I thought about those other women she had mentioned, Caroline, Melissa, and wondered if they had made this same discovery, had seen the charming mask slip to reveal the manipulation beneath. "Be careful," I said, surprised by my own concern for this woman who had, however unknowingly, played a role in my pain. "Edward doesn't like losing what he considers his." Kenna nodded, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "I know. That's partly why I wanted to talk to you. I thought perhaps maybe we could help each other." "Help each other," I repeated, uncertain of her meaning. "I have information," she said, lowering her voice, "about his business dealings, his personal accounts, things I've overheard, documents I've seen at the apartment, things that might help you in your divorce." I studied her, trying to discern her motives. "Why would you do that?" She hesitated, then spoke with quiet resolve. "Because I made a mistake getting involved with a married man. I'm trying to make it right in the only way I can, and because I'm afraid of what he might do when I try to leave." As I looked at this young woman across the table, afraid, remorseful, seeking a way out of a situation that had spiraled beyond her control, I felt an unexpected kinship. We had both been deceived by Edward, had both believed in a version of him that existed primarily in our own hopes and projections. "I'm meeting with Edward tomorrow," I told her. "After that, depending on how things go, we can talk again." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you. I didn't expect you to even listen to me, much less—" "I haven't agreed to anything yet," I cautioned her. "But I understand what it's like to realize the person you trusted is not who you thought they were." As I left the coffee shop, my mind was racing with this unexpected development. Kenna might be lying, might be setting me up for some scheme Edward had concocted. But my instincts told me her fear was genuine, her regret real. And if what she said about the other women was true, if Edward had a pattern of manipulation that extended beyond our marriage, then perhaps the man I had built a life with was even more of a stranger than I had realized. That night, as I prepared for my meeting with Edward, I thought about Kenna's revelations, about the photographs on my bookshelf, about the slow unraveling of truth that had been happening beneath the surface of my life for longer than I cared to admit. Tomorrow, I would face Edward not just as a betrayed wife, but as a woman beginning to see the full scope of his deception. And whatever happened in that meeting would determine not just my future, but perhaps Kenna's as well. Two women connected by the machinations of a man who had underestimated them both. The Princeton Club loomed before me, its stately facade a monument to old money and established power, exactly the world Edward had always aspired to inhabit. As Quinn's car pulled up to the curb, rain beaded on the windows like tears, distorting the view of the entrance where Edward would be waiting. "I'll be right here," Quinn said, his hand briefly covering mine. "Call me the second you're done, or if anything feels wrong." I nodded, squeezing his hand in return. "I'll be fine." But as I made my way up the stone steps, umbrella tilted against the steady rain, I wasn't entirely sure that was true. My conversation with Kenna the previous day had shaken me more than I cared to admit. The Edward she had described, a serial manipulator with a history of office affairs, aligned too neatly with behaviors I had explained away for years. It was like having a missing puzzle piece suddenly snap into place, completing a picture I had been avoiding. The doorman greeted me with practiced deference, directing me to a private dining room on the second floor. Each step up the grand staircase felt weighted, significant. The last time I would approach Edward as his wife, the last time I would engage with him on his terms rather than mine. He stood when I entered the room, rising from a table set for an intimate breakfast. Edward had always been handsome in the classical sense, tall, with the kind of features that photographed well for annual reports in alumni magazines. Today, he wore the navy suit I had helped him select last year, his silver tie a perfect complement to his prematurely gray hair, the picture of refined success. "Elizabeth," he said, my full name in his mouth, a formality that contrasted sharply with the nickname, Liz, he had used throughout our marriage. "Thank you for meeting me." I remained standing just inside the doorway, unwilling to be drawn into the scene he had arranged. Fresh flowers on the table, a bottle of Pellegrino with lemon, my preference, morning light filtering through rain-streaked windows. Edward had always been meticulous about setting the stage for difficult conversations. "What do you want, Edward?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. His smile faltered slightly at my directness. "I thought we could talk, without lawyers, without all the hostility." "Hostility," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "Is that what you call my response to finding our accounts emptied while I was burying my mother?" A flicker of something, not quite guilt, perhaps discomfort, crossed his face. "That's partly why I wanted to meet. There are things you don't understand about what happened." "Then enlighten me." I still hadn't moved deeper into the room, maintaining the distance between us like a shield. Edward gestured to the chair across from his. "Please, Liz, sit. Let's talk like the rational people we both are." Rational. It had been one of his favorite words, often deployed when my emotions didn't align with his preferences. "You're being irrational," he would say when I questioned business trips that seemed unnecessarily extended, when I expressed discomfort with his late nights at the office. I didn't sit, and after a moment Edward sighed and returned to his own chair. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice taking on the measured tone he used in board meetings. "A serious error in judgment. I panicked when I heard rumors about a potential audit at the firm. I moved our assets to protect them, not to steal from you." "And changing the locks on our apartment? Was that also to protect me?" He had the grace to look away. "I wasn't thinking clearly. Seeing you come back from your mother's funeral, it made everything real in a way I wasn't prepared for. I handled it badly. I'm sorry." The apology sounded rehearsed, a calculated concession offered to smooth the way for whatever he really wanted. I thought of Kenna's words from yesterday. "He's lying to us both." "Your girlfriend called me," I said, watching his face carefully. Edward went very still, only his eyes moving as they snapped to mine, suddenly sharp with attention. "Kenna called you? When?" "Yesterday. She had some interesting things to say about your history with women at the firm." His expression closed off, the practiced vulnerability replaced by something harder. "Kenna is young, naive. She's confused about our relationship. She seemed quite clear about Caroline from accounting and Melissa from legal." Edward stood abruptly, moving to the window where he kept his back to me for several seconds, hands clasped behind him in a posture I had seen countless times when he was formulating strategy. "Whatever Kenna told you is irrelevant to our situation," he finally said, turning back to face me. "The fact remains that we built a life together." 12 years, Elizabeth, that means something. "It meant nothing when you drained our accounts," I replied, feeling a strange calm descend as I recognized the familiar pattern. Edward's attempt to reframe the narrative, to shift focus away from his actions to the emotions and history he could leverage. He moved toward me then, closing half the distance between us, his expression softening into the one that had once made my heart flutter. Concerned, intimate, created just for me. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust, but we can rebuild. We've both made mistakes." "Both?" I interrupted, incredulous. What mistakes have I made, Edward? Trusting you? Believing in our marriage? Supporting your career, even? When it meant putting my own ambitions on hold. Something flashed in his eyes, irritation at being challenged, quickly masked. That's not what I meant. I'm trying to find a way forward for us. There is no us anymore, I said simply. You made sure of that. He stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. This isn't like you, Liz. This hardness, this unwillingness to even consider reconciliation. Is this Quinn's influence? Has he been poisoning you against me? The question was so perfectly Edward. The assumption that my stance could only be explained by someone else's influence, never by my own judgment or resolve. No one needed to poison me against you, Edward. You did that all by yourself. He stepped closer, and I resisted the urge to back away. Tell me what you want, then. Name your price. My price? I echoed, genuinely startled. For a fresh start, for putting this ugliness behind us. His voice had taken on the tone he used in negotiations. Reasonable, open to compromise, but with an undercurrent of calculation. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized with sudden clarity that I felt nothing. Not anger, not love, not even regret. Just a profound emptiness where my feelings for him had once resided. There is no price, Edward. What I want is my freedom. What I want is for you to sign the settlement agreement and move on with your life. Edward's face hardened at my words, the mask of conciliation dropping away to reveal something colder, more calculating. He moved back to the table, picking up a leather portfolio I hadn't noticed before. Before you make any final decisions, he said, his voice taking on the crisp tone he used in business negotiations, there are some things you should know. He removed several documents from the portfolio, laying them out with deliberate precision. Your hidden assets aren't as hidden as you think. My heart stuttered, but I kept my expression neutral. I have no idea what you're talking about. Edward's smile was sharp-edged, reminiscent of the expression he wore when closing a difficult deal. The apartment on 73rd Street. The investment. Account with Meridian Partners. The foundation transfers. He tapped each document as he spoke, and I recognized them with a sinking feeling. Property records, account statements, financial transfers. Things that Quinn and Dominique had assured me were discreet, protected. Your cousin isn't the only one with resources, Edward continued, watching my face. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate? That I wouldn't find out what you've been hiding? I struggled to maintain my composure, even as my mind raced to understand how he had discovered information that should have been inaccessible to him. Those assets were never part of our marital property. They're mine, established with my inheritance long before we married. Perhaps, Edward conceded, but timing can be ambiguous. Funds can be commingled, and judges tend to take a dim view of assets deliberately concealed during divorce proceedings. I haven't concealed anything, I replied, anger rising to replace my momentary uncertainty. Everything has been properly disclosed to your attorney. Buried in thousands of pages of documentation, Edward countered. A strategy I might admire, under different circumstances. He collected the documents, returning them to his portfolio. But the question remains, what happens when I challenge these claims? When I force a thorough investigation of every transaction, every property, every account? I understood his threat clearly. Edward couldn't legally touch my separate assets, but he could drag the divorce through the courts for years, could create legal fees and complications that would drain the very resources I was trying to protect. What do you want, Edward? I asked, though I already knew the answer. A reasonable settlement, he replied smoothly. One that acknowledges my contributions to our life together, one that allows us both to move forward with dignity. Translation, he wanted money. More than the settlement Dominique had proposed, more than he deserved after what he had done. It was pure Edward, using information as leverage, turning even his own wrongdoing into a negotiating advantage. "I'll have Dominique contact Ashton," I said, moving toward the door. This meeting was over. "One more thing," Edward said, his voice stopping me before I could leave. "I've been offered a position in London. Senior partner, international division." I turned back, puzzled by this apparent non sequitur. "Congratulations." "The thing is," he continued as if I hadn't spoken, "it's a significant opportunity, career-defining, but it would mean liquidating certain investments quickly, transferring assets overseas. The current situation is making that impossible." Understanding dawned. The London position explained everything: why Edward had emptied our accounts, why he was now desperate for a quick settlement. It wasn't just about Kenna or financial panic. It was about a fresh start in a new country, a chance to reinvent himself away from the consequences of his actions here. "So that's the real reason for this meeting," I said. "You need this resolved quickly so you can take your new job and your new girlfriend to London." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face at my directness. "It's a tremendous opportunity, Liz. For both of us, actually. A clean break. You'll never have to see me again." The irony was almost laughable. After emptying our accounts, after moving his girlfriend into an apartment we had once shared, Edward was now trying to frame his departure as a favor to me. "Sign the settlement agreement Dominique prepared," I told him, "and you can go wherever you want." Edward shook his head, his expression hardening. "That agreement is inadequate. I need more liquidity for the move, for establishing my new life in London." "Your lack of liquidity is a problem of your own making," I reminded him. "Perhaps you should have considered your future needs before emptying our joint accounts." He stepped closer, dropping his voice. "Be reasonable, Elizabeth. I can make this divorce very difficult for you. Expensive. Public. Is that really what you want? More pain? More embarrassment?" The threat hung in the air between us, and I felt a surge of clarity that was almost dizzying. This was who Edward truly was, not the charming, successful husband I had believed in for 12 years, but a man who would use anything, including intimidation, to get what he wanted. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Edward," I said quietly. "And I'm not afraid of the truth becoming public. Are you?" He stilled, wariness creeping into his expression. What is that supposed to mean? I thought of Kenna's revelations about Edward's pattern with women at the firm. I thought of Quinn's discoveries about questionable business dealings. I thought of my own silence over years of subtle manipulation. "It means I'm done protecting you," I replied. "From your partners, from your own actions, from the consequences of your choices." Edward studied me, as if seeing a stranger rather than the woman he had been married to for over a decade. "You've changed," he said finally. "No," I corrected him. "I've remembered who I was before you convinced me to be someone else." For a moment, something like genuine regret flickered across his face, but it was quickly replaced by the calculated look I had come to recognize all too well. "I'll have Ashton call Dominique," he said, turning away. "Perhaps we can find a creative solution." I left without another word, the heavy door of the private dining room closing behind me with a finality that felt appropriate. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the club's windows with percussive insistence. As I descended the grand staircase, my phone buzzed with a text from Quinn. "Everything okay?" I paused at the bottom of the stairs, considering how to respond. The meeting had not gone as Edward had planned. He had expected to intimidate me, to leverage information for a more favorable settlement. Instead, he had revealed his own desperation, his need for a quick resolution. On my way out, I texted back, "Need to talk. Edward knows about the apartment." Quinn's response was immediate. How? That was the question that troubled me most. How had Edward discovered information that should have been securely protected? Who had access to those records, those accounts? Who would have shared them with a man desperate to regain financial control? As I pushed through the heavy doors of the Princeton Club, the doorman rushing forward with an umbrella, another text arrived. Not from Quinn this time, but from Kenna. Need to see you urgently. He knows we talked. My stomach tightened with apprehension. If Edward knew about my meeting with Kenna, what else did he know? And more importantly, what might he do with that knowledge? Quinn was waiting at the curb, his car idling in the no parking zone, his expression clearing with relief when he saw me. I slid into the passenger seat, the warmth of the car a stark contrast to the chill that had settled inside me. "That bad?" Quinn asked, studying my face. "Worse," I replied, showing him Kenna's text. "Edward knows things he shouldn't know. About the apartment, about my meeting with Kenna. Someone is feeding him information." Quinn's expression darkened. Ashton Pierce wouldn't risk his license by sharing confidential information. "Then who?" I asked, though I already had my suspicions. The circle of people with knowledge of my financial arrangements was small. Quinn, Dominique, Mary, and Carlos, I said, naming the private investigator Quinn had recommended to me. Months ago, when I'd first begun to suspect Edward's infidelity. Carlos Mendoza, a former colleague of Quinn's from the district attorney's office, now running his own security firm. Quinn shook his head. "Carlos is solid. I've known him for 15 years. "Someone isn't," I insisted. Edward knew details about transactions that were supposed to be confidential. He even had documentation. Quinn pulled into traffic, his expression thoughtful. "I'll look into it. In the meantime, we need to warn Dominique. If Edward is gathering ammunition, we need to be prepared for whatever he's planning." I nodded, looking out at the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, at the people hurrying along the sidewalks under umbrellas and raincoats, leading lives that suddenly seemed enviably uncomplicated. "What did he want?" Quinn asked after a moment. "Beyond intimidating you with information he shouldn't have." "Money," I replied. "A faster settlement. He's been offered a position in London and needs liquidity for the move." Quinn glanced at me, surprise evident in his expression. "London? That's convenient." "For him, maybe. A fresh start, away from the mess he's created here. Or away from potential legal consequences," Quinn suggested, his prosecutor's mind, immediately identifying the alternative motivation. International transfers make funds harder to trace, harder to recover. The implication hung between us, that Edward's desire to leave the country might be driven by more than a career opportunity, that the financial maneuvers Quinn had uncovered might be more serious than we had initially believed. "What about Kenna?" Quinn asked. "Can we trust her? Or is this urgent meeting just another way for Edward to manipulate the situation?" I considered the fear I had seen in Kenna's eyes yesterday, the genuine distress in her voice as she described Edward's changing behavior. "I think she's afraid of him," I said. "And I think that fear is legitimate." Quinn nodded, making a decision. "I'll have Carlos meet us at your apartment. If there's a security concern, we need to address it immediately." As we drove through the rain-drenched city, I thought about the man I had just left, the husband I had once loved, now revealed as someone capable of threats, of intimidation, of using anything and anyone to achieve his goals. I had walked into that meeting believing I was prepared for whatever Edward might say or do. Now I wasn't so sure. The game had changed, the stakes had risen, and I had the uneasy feeling that the true complications were only just beginning to reveal themselves. As Quinn's car wound through the city streets toward my apartment, my mind drifted back to the beginning, to the day I'd met Edward Blackwell and how utterly charmed I had been by him. It was at a fundraising gala for the Children's Literacy Foundation, where I volunteered. I was 31 then, recently promoted at the investment firm where I'd worked since graduating from Wharton, full of ambition and idealism in equal measure. Edward, 5 years my senior, had attended the gala with one of the foundation's major donors. He'd stood out immediately, tall, impeccably dressed, with a presence that drew people to him like moths to flame. Elizabeth Turner, he'd said when we were introduced, repeating my name as if committing it carefully to memory. The financial analyst who convinced Reynolds Corporation to donate that impressive children's library in Harlem. I'd been flattered that he knew of my work with the foundation, that he'd bothered to remember such a detail. Later, I would understand. This is Edward's standard operating procedure, researching people before meeting them, identifying details that would make them feel special, seen. But in that moment, I had simply been impressed by his attentiveness. Our courtship had been a whirlwind of elegant dinners, cultural events, and weekend getaways. Edward was a junior partner at Hansen & Pierce at the time, clearly on the rise, hungry for success in a way that seemed admirable rather than concerning. We shared similar backgrounds, both raised in comfortable but not wealthy families, both the first in our families to attend Ivy League schools, both determined to build something significant with our lives. We're going to be quite the power couple, he'd told me on our third date, and I'd laughed, charmed by his confidence, by the ease with which he saw our separate lives merging into a shared future. 6 months after we met, Edward proposed during a weekend in the Berkshires. The ring was perfect, elegant but not ostentatious, exactly what I would have chosen for myself. It was as if he had studied me, learned my tastes, anticipated my desires. Only years later would I realize that this careful observation was not about understanding me, but about calibrating his performance to ensure my response. The prenuptial agreement came 2 months before the wedding, presented as a matter of practical financial planning. "It's just to protect us both," Edward had said, sliding the document across the table of the sleek midtown restaurant where we were having dinner. Standard procedure for people at our level. I remember feeling a flicker of unease, not at the concept of a prenup itself, which seemed reasonable given our professional backgrounds, but at the timing. We had already sent out invitations, booked the venue, made all the arrangements for a wedding that had somehow grown larger and more elaborate than I had initially envisioned. "I should have my own lawyer look at this," I said, a statement that should have been obvious but somehow felt like a challenge in the moment. Edward's smile had tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, though Hansen & Pierce drafted it, so it's completely standard, nothing to worry about." I had asked Quinn to recommend someone, and that was how I first met Dominique Rivera, then a rising attorney at a midtown firm specializing in family law, now one of the city's most sought-after divorce lawyers. "This is heavily weighted in his favor," Dominique had told me bluntly after reviewing the document. "It essentially protects all of his future earnings and assets while providing minimal protection for yours." When I brought Dominique's concerns to Edward, his response had been a masterclass in manipulation. Not anger, not defensiveness, but hurt bewilderment. "I thought we were building a life together," he'd said, his voice soft with disappointment. "These distinctions between mine and yours, that's not how I see our future." But he had agreed to revisions, some of them at least. Enough that Dominique had reluctantly advised me the agreement was acceptable, if not ideal. And so I had signed, eager to move past this momentary discomfort, to return to the harmony that had characterized our relationship until then. The wedding was everything a society wedding should be. The historic church on the Upper East Side, the reception at the Botanic Garden, my dress from a designer whose waiting list was legendary. In the photographs, we looked radiant, perfect. And for a time, perhaps we were. The first years of our marriage had been good ones. We were both focused on our careers, both climbing our respective ladders with determination and skill. Edward made partner at Hansen & Pierce ahead of schedule. I was approached by Meridian Partners, a boutique investment firm known for its innovative approach and ethical standards. We moved from our starter apartment in Murray Hill to a larger place in Gramercy, then finally to the penthouse on Park Avenue that Edward had coveted, a statement residence that announced our arrival in New York's upper echelons. It was around the time of that final move that things began to shift. Subtly at first, so subtly that I questioned my own perceptions. Edward's late nights at the office became more frequent. His interest in my work, once so enthusiastic, waned. He began to make small but cutting remarks about my clothing choices, my friends, my opinions at dinner parties. "You might want to let me handle the investment discussion," he'd murmur as we prepared for social events. "Stevens is a potential client, and these technical details can be off-putting." I had pushed back initially. "Edward, I literally manage investment portfolios for a living. I think I can handle discussing bond yields at a dinner party." His response had been a laugh and a kiss on the cheek, affectionate, dismissive. "Of course you can, darling. I just don't want you to have to talk shop on our night out." It was always like that. His criticisms couched as concern, his controlling behavior presented as care. And gradually, I found myself yielding, adjusting, accommodating. Not because I believed he was right, but because the effort of constant resistance was exhausting. When my mother was diagnosed with cancer 4 years ago, the fault lines in our marriage became more pronounced. Edward was supportive initially, making all the right gestures, saying all the right things. But as her illness progressed, as my visits to the hospital became more frequent, his patience wore thin. "You know, there are professionals who can help with this," he said one night after I returned late from the hospital. "Nurses, care managers, you don't have to be there every day." "She's my mother, Edward," I'd replied, too tired to mask my hurt. "I want to be there," he had sighed, rubbing his temples as if I were being deliberately obtuse. "I understand that, but you're letting everything else slide. The foundation gala is next month, and you've barely looked at the seating arrangements. And Meredith mentioned you missed the committee meeting yesterday. The foundation gala, the seating arrangements, as if these social obligations somehow outweighed my mother's deteriorating health. Her need for comfort and companionship in what we both knew were her final months. It was during those hospital visits, those long hours sitting beside my mother's bed, that I began to see my marriage with new clarity. My mother, never one to interfere, had finally spoken up. "He doesn't make you happy anymore, Lizzie," she'd said one afternoon, her voice weak, but her gaze sharp as ever. "I see it in your eyes." I had tried to deny it, to make excuses. But my mother, with the piercing insight of someone whose time was limited, had cut through my defenses. "Life is too short for this kind of compromise," she'd told me, squeezing my hand with what little strength she had left. "Too short to become less than who you are." 2 months after that conversation, as my mother's condition worsened, I received a call from Quinn that would set in motion everything that followed. "I need to talk to you," he'd said, his tone unusually serious. "About Edward, about some financial discrepancies I've noticed." Quinn had been handling my mother's estate planning, updating her will and organizing her assets in preparation for the inevitable. In the process, he had come across transfers from accounts connected to Edward, transfers that raised red flags for someone with Quinn's background in financial crimes prosecution. "It may be nothing," Quinn had cautioned, "but I think you should take some precautions." Those precautions had included establishing separate accounts for my personal inheritance from my father, which had been sitting largely untouched in investment accounts since his death a decade earlier. Quinn had introduced me to Carlos Mendoza, who had helped me establish security measures, new passwords, separate email accounts, a post office box for sensitive communications. At the time, these steps had felt excessive, even paranoid. I had still believed, despite the growing distance between us, that Edward and I were fundamentally on the same team, that whatever his flaws, he would never deliberately harm me. That belief had sustained me through my mother's final decline, through the funeral arrangements, through the crushing grief of returning to a world without her in it, Until I had logged into our joint accounts the day after her funeral and found them empty. Until I had tried to enter our apartment and discovered the locks changed. Until I had called Edward's cell phone repeatedly, only to have each call go straight to voicemail. The betrayal had been so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that for the first 24 hours I had been too shocked to even process what was happening. It was Quinn who had sprung into action, who had used his legal connections to get me access to the apartment long enough to collect essential personal items, who had insisted I stay with him and Mary until we could assess the full extent of Edward's actions. And it was Dominique who had taken one look at the prenuptial agreement, at the financial documentation, at the timing of Edward's moves, and had smiled the grim smile of someone who had seen this scenario before. He made one critical mistake, she'd told me during our first meeting in her office. He assumed you had no resources outside of what he knew about. That's where we'll start. Carlos Mendoza was already waiting at my apartment when Quinn and I arrived, his broad shoulders and close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair unmistakable even from a distance. He straightened as we approached, his expression grave. "Elizabeth, Quinn," he greeted us, his voice carrying the faint traces of a Bronx upbringing despite decades in more polished environments. "Let's talk inside." As Quinn unlocked the door, I noticed Carlos scanning the hallway, his eyes sweeping the space with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to identify threats. It was an unsettling reminder that my situation might have escalated beyond a bitter divorce into something potentially dangerous. Once inside, Carlos didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We have a problem," he said, taking a seat at my kitchen island. "Your digital security has been compromised." Quinn's posture stiffened. "How?" "We set up everything with encrypted channels, separate devices." "Spyware," Carlos cut in, his expression darkening. "Sophisticated stuff. Not the kind of thing an angry husband typically has access to. Unless that husband is a corporate attorney with connections to tech companies and significant financial resources," I pointed out, a chill settling over me at the implications. Carlos nodded. "Exactly. I ran a sweep of your devices after Quinn texted me about Edward's information. Your personal laptop has been compromised for at least 3 months, possibly longer." 3 months? I echoed, mentally calculating. That would be around the time my mother's condition worsened when I was barely at home. "When you would have been distracted, less likely to notice any changes in your computer's performance," Carlos confirmed. "The software is designed to be undetectable, but it gives the user access to everything: emails, files, browsing history, even passwords if they're stored," Quinn cursed under his breath. "That's how he knew about the apartment, the accounts, the—" Violation felt profound, intimate, the digital equivalent of someone rifling through my personal journals, my private thoughts. While I had been sitting at my mother's bedside, consumed with grief and worry, Edward had been systematically invading my privacy, gathering ammunition for the moment he decided to strike. "Can you remove it?" I asked Carlos. "Already done," he replied. "And I've set up enhanced security measures. But we need to assume that Edward has had access to anything you've viewed or stored on that computer, including my communications with Dominique," I realized with growing horror. "Our strategy discussions, the documentation of his financial irregularities, everything." Quinn pulled out his phone. "I'll call Dominique now. We need to adjust our approach before tomorrow's court filing." As Quinn stepped into the living room to make the call, Carlos leaned forward, his voice dropping. "There's something else you should know, Elizabeth. This kind of surveillance. It's not just about gathering information. It's about control. About knowing your opponent's next move before they make it." "You think Edward is dangerous?" I asked directly, needing clarity rather than comforting evasions. Carlos chose his words carefully. "I think a man who goes to these lengths to monitor his wife, who empties accounts and changes locks while she's at her mother's deathbed, is unpredictable. And unpredictable people pose risks." The assessment was clinical, professional, but it sent a shiver through me nonetheless. Edward, who had once been the center of my world, who had held me through nights of doubt and disappointment, who had promised to love and protect me, now represented a potential threat, not just to my financial security, but perhaps to my safety. "What? About Kenna?" I asked, remembering her urgent text. "If Edward knows we met—" "I've already reached out to her," Carlos assured me. "Offered protection if she needs it. She's scared, Elizabeth. Says Edward's behavior has become erratic, controlling." Quinn returned, his expression grim. "Dominique wants to meet tonight. She's bringing in a forensic specialist to help assess what Edward might have learned and how it impacts our strategy." The weight of the situation pressed down on me. The invasion of privacy, the looming court battle, the potential danger to both Kenna and myself. For months I had been responding to Edward's actions, scrambling to protect what remained of my assets and dignity. Always defensive, always a step behind. "No," I said suddenly, the word emerging with unexpected force. "No more meetings, no more adjustments, no more playing catch-up." Quinn and Carlos exchanged glances. "What are you thinking?" Quinn asked cautiously. I moved to the window, looking out at the city as evening approached, lights beginning to glimmer against the darkening sky. In that moment, with perfect clarity, I saw what I needed to do. "I'm tired of reacting to Edward," I said, turning back to face them. "Tired of him setting the terms, controlling the narrative. It's time we take the offensive." Carlos raised an eyebrow, professional interest peaked. "What do you have in mind?" "Edward wants a quick settlement so he can take the London position. He's been monitoring my communications, gathering information, using Kenna." I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what I was about to propose. "So let's give him exactly what he wants, but on our terms." Over the next hour, the three of us outlined a strategy that was admittedly risky, but potentially decisive. Instead of fighting Edward's demand for a faster settlement, we would embrace it, but with conditions carefully crafted to protect my interests while appearing to give him what he needed. We would use his own surveillance against him, feeding false information through channels we knew were compromised while securing our actual communications through new, clean devices Carlos would provide. Most crucially, we would bring Kenna fully into our confidence, offering her protection and support in exchange for her cooperation in documenting Edward's behavior and business dealings. "This is aggressive," Quinn warned as we finalized the details. "If Edward realizes what we're doing, he—" "Won't," I interrupted with newfound confidence, "because he believes he already knows everything. His surveillance has made him overconfident, careless." Carlos nodded slowly, professional approval evident in his expression. "It could work. The best defense is often a good offense." As they prepared to leave, Quinn to brief Dominique, Carlos to set up our new secure communication system, I felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time since discovering Edward's betrayal, I wasn't simply responding to disaster. I was taking control, shaping events rather than being shaped by them. "Are you sure about this?" Quinn asked at the door, concern evident in his eyes. "Once we start down this path—" "I'm sure," I replied, the decision settling into certainty within me. Edward thought he could leave me with nothing. He was wrong, and it's time he understands exactly how wrong. After they left, I stood in the quiet of my apartment, the weight of my decision both heavy and empowering. I thought of my mother's words from her hospital bed. "Life is too short for this kind of compromise, too short to become less than who you are." For years, I had compromised my ambitions, my perspectives, my very sense of self, gradually becoming less than who I truly was. Edward had encouraged this diminishment, had benefited from my increasing deference to his judgment and priorities. Even after discovering his betrayal, I had been reacting to his moves, playing by his rules. No more. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the secure line Carlos had set up for Kenna. Meeting place confirmed. We'll be there at 8. Looked at the clock. Just over an hour to prepare. I moved to my closet, selecting clothes not for their style or elegance, but for their practicality, their mobility. For what might lie ahead. As I changed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, determined, focused, a woman I barely recognized and yet somehow knew intimately. The woman I had been before Edward, before the years of subtle undermining had clouded my confidence. The woman my mother had seen even when I couldn't see her myself. The choice I was making carried risks, legal, financial, perhaps even physical. Edward, cornered and exposed, might become truly dangerous rather than merely threatening. But the alternative, continuing to react, to defend, to diminish myself in the face of his machinations, was no longer acceptable. My phone buzzed again, Quinn this time, on the new secure line. Dominique is on board. Mary, too. We've got your back. I texted back a simple, thank you, gratitude welling for these people who had stood by me, who had seen my strength even when I doubted it myself. Outside, rain had begun to fall again, pattering against the windows like gentle applause. I gathered my things, the documents Carlos had prepared, the recorder disguised as a stylish pen, the new phone with its encrypted communications. Tonight would set in motion events that could not be undone, would commit us all to a course of action with uncertain outcomes. But as I left the apartment, locking the door behind me, I felt none of the anxiety that had become my constant companion these past months. Instead, there was only resolve, clarity, and the quiet certainty that I was, at last, reclaiming not just my assets, but myself. Edward had made the critical mistake of underestimating me, of believing that the woman he had systematically diminished over years of marriage was the only version of me that existed. He was about to discover how wrong he had been. As I stepped out into the rain-washed evening, I thought again of my mother's words. Life is too short to become less than who you are. Tonight, I would begin becoming more. The cafe where I was meeting Kenna was tucked away on a quiet side street in the West Village, far from Edward's usual haunts, from the sleek midtown restaurants and Upper East Side establishments where we had spent most of our married life. It was a deliberate choice, a place where neither of us would be recognized, where Edward's network of business associates and social connections would not reach. The rain had eased to a gentle mist by the time my taxi pulled up outside. Through the window, I could see Kenna already waiting, seated at a corner table partially obscured by a lush potted plant. She was dressed casually in jeans and an oversized sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, a stark contrast to the polished, designer-clad woman I had imagined when I first learned of her existence. As I approached her table, I noticed the subtle signs of stress, the slight redness around her eyes, the nervous way she turned her coffee cup in continuous small circles. The smartphone placed face up beside her hand, checked compulsively every few seconds. "Thank you for coming," she said as I slid into the chair across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "You said it was urgent," I replied, studying her face. Up close, she looked even younger than her 27 years, vulnerable in a way that stirred an unexpected protective instinct. She glanced around the cafe before leaning forward. "Edward knows we met. He went through my phone last night while I was in the shower. He saw the call log and he wasn't happy." The careful neutrality of that phrase, "wasn't happy," spoke volumes. I recognized the euphemism, had used similar ones myself over the years to describe Edward's coldness, his cutting remarks, his ability to fill a room with tension without raising his voice. "Did he hurt you?" I asked directly. Kenna's eyes widened. "Not physically. Edward would never—" She trailed off, perhaps hearing the automatic defense in her own words, the same defense I had offered to concerned friends during the darker periods of my marriage. He was very angry, said I was betraying him, conspiring against him, that after everything he'd done for me, this was how I repaid him. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. He's different now. Since your meeting yesterday, since the divorce proceedings started. He's obsessed with checking his phone, his email. He barely sleeps. And She hesitated, searching for the right word. He's mean in a way he never was before. Cold. Like he's looking right through me. I nodded, recognizing the description all too well. Edward's charm had always been a tool, deployed precisely when beneficial, withdrawn when no longer necessary. Kenna was experiencing what happened when you were no longer useful to Edward Blackwell, when you represented an obstacle rather than an asset. What else did he say after he found out about our meeting? I asked, suspecting there was more she wasn't telling me. Kenna's gaze dropped to the table. He said you were manipulating me, that you were bitter, vindictive, that you'd try to use me against him. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. He said you'd destroyed other people who crossed you. I couldn't help the short, startled laugh that escaped me. Did he give any examples of these destroyed people? No, she admitted. But he was very convincing. Edward can be, when he focuses all his attention on you, makes you the center of his world, it's hard not to believe him. I know, I said softly, the simple acknowledgement creating a moment of connection between us. Two women who had fallen under the same spell, who understood the particular vulnerability of loving someone capable of such calculated charm. Kenna reached into her bag, withdrawing a slim USB drive which she slid across the table. This is why I needed to see you. There are documents on here, emails, financial records, things I found on Edward's laptop while he was in the shower this morning. I looked at the small device, then back at her. You copied his files? She nodded, a flicker of defiance crossing her face. After what you told me, after how he reacted when he found out we'd spoken, I needed to know the truth. About him, about what he's been doing. Her voice dropped. There are emails about the London position. It's not what he told. Me? It's not a promotion. He's running from something. Before I could respond, the bell above the cafe door jingled, and Kenna's gaze shot toward the entrance. The momentary panic in her eyes eased when she saw it was just a college-aged couple shaking rain from their umbrellas. He doesn't know. You're here? I asked, though the answer seemed obvious from her reaction. No. I told him I was meeting a friend from work, but he's been tracking my phone. I left it at my friend's apartment before coming here. The subterfuge showed a level of caution, of strategic thinking, that surprised me. Perhaps Kenna was more resilient than I had initially given her credit for. Have you looked at everything on this drive? I asked, picking up the USB but not yet pocketing it. Some of it, she replied. Enough to know it's not good. There are emails about something called Project Titanium that seemed to make him nervous when his partners brought it up at dinner last week. And records of transfers to accounts I've never heard of, with names that sound like companies but don't turn up anything when you Google them. Project Titanium. The name triggered a vague memory, Edward mentioning it in passing months ago, dismissing my question about it with a wave of his hand in a just boring legal work, nothing you'd find interesting. Like so many of his deflections, I had let it go at the time, accepting his judgment about what would or wouldn't interest me. Why are you doing this? I asked Kenna, genuinely curious. Why help me? She was silent for a moment, her fingers returning to their nervous rotation of the coffee cup. When I met Edward, he was everything. Successful, charming, attentive. He made me feel special, chosen. When he told me his marriage was just a shell, that you two had grown apart, I believed him. Because I wanted to believe him. Her eyes met mine, regret evident in their depths. I never stopped to think about you as a real person, about what it would feel like to be in your position. And then when I saw him after your meeting yesterday, saw how coldly he talked about cleaning out your accounts while you were with your dying mother, she shook her head. I realized I didn't know him at all, and that scared me. It was painfully familiar, the gradual disillusionment, the growing recognition that the charming man you had fallen for was capable of calculated cruelty, of using people as means to ends rather than as beings worthy of care and respect. He's never going to let me go easily, Kenna continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I know too much now. I've seen too much. The only way out is to... She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. To make sure he can't hurt either of us again, I finished for her. She nodded, relief evident in her expression, relief at being understood, at not having to explain the fear that came with recognizing what Edward truly was. The information on this drive, I said, finally slipping it into my purse. It could help with that, but using it carries risks, for both of us. I know, Kenna replied, a newfound steadiness in her voice. But staying with him, pretending, I don't see what he is, that's a bigger risk. The maturity of her assessment surprised me again. I had initially imagined her as a naive young woman, seduced by Edward's charm and status. But there was a core of strength in her, a clarity that perhaps came from seeing Edward without the years of gradual manipulation that had clouded my own perspective. Carlos Mendoza, I said, writing the name and number on a napkin and sliding it across the table. He's a security consultant working with me. If you feel unsafe, if Edward's behavior escalates, call him, day or night. Kenna took the napkin, folding it carefully before tucking it into her wallet. What happens now? With the divorce? With everything? Now, I said, feeling the weight of the USB drive in my purse, the weight of the decision I had made earlier that day. We stop reacting to Edward. We start acting on our own terms. As I outlined the strategy Quinn, Carlos, and I had developed, the controlled flow of information, the careful documentation, the coordinated legal approach, I saw something shift in Kenna's expression. Fear didn't disappear, but it was joined by something stronger, more resolute. He'll fight back, she warned. When Edward feels cornered, he gets dangerous. I know, I acknowledged. That's why we need to be prepared for anything. That's why we need to move quickly, decisively. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights. As we prepared to leave, Kenna hesitated, then asked the question that perhaps had been on her mind throughout our conversation. After everything he's done, after everything you know now, do you hate him? I considered the question carefully, searching my feelings for the man who had been the center of my world for 12 years. No, I said finally. I don't hate Edward, but I see him clearly now. And that's more dangerous to him than hatred could ever be. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, the rain-washed streets of Manhattan gleaming in the early sunlight as I made my way to Dominique's office. I carried the USB drive Kenna had given me in my purse, its small weight seemingly disproportionate to its potential impact on our case against Edward. Dominique's corner office on the 38th floor of a midtown tower offered a panoramic view of the city, but today neither of us was interested in the scenery. She sat across from me at her conference table, scrolling through the files from Kenna's USB drive on her laptop, her expression growing increasingly grave. This is substantial, she said finally, looking up at me. The offshore accounts, the irregular transfers, the emails about Project Titanium, it confirms everything Quinn suspected and more. Can we use it? I asked, the question that had kept me awake most of the night. Dominique sighed, closing her laptop. That's complicated. The information was obtained without Edward's knowledge or consent. There are serious questions about admissibility. But it's real, I pressed. It proves what he's been doing. It's not just about what's true, Elizabeth. It's about what's legally actionable. She leaned forward, her expression serious. Using illegally obtained evidence can backfire spectacularly. It could damage our case, your credibility, even expose Kenna to potential legal consequences. This was the first major obstacle in our new offensive strategy. The realization that the smoking gun Kenna had provided might be too hot to handle in court. So we have proof of Edward's financial misconduct, but we can't use it? The frustration in my voice was unmistakable. I didn't say that, Dominique replied, a hint of the strategic brilliance that made her one of the city's top divorce attorneys emerging in her smile. We can't introduce it directly as evidence, but we can use it to guide our investigation, to know exactly where to look, what to request through proper legal channels. She stood, moving to the whiteboard that took up most of one wall of her office. Think of it as a map. We can't show the judge the map itself, but we can use it to navigate to destinations we can legally visit. As Dominique began outlining our revised approach, my phone buzzed with a text from Carlos on our secure line. Problem. Call when you can. I excused myself, stepping into the hallway to return his call. What's wrong? I asked without preamble when he answered. Edward is moving money, Carlos replied, his voice tense. Large transfers from the accounts we've been monitoring. He's liquidating assets faster than we anticipated. My heart sank. The London position? Maybe, but there's more. He's scheduled a flight to Zurich for tomorrow morning. Switzerland. Banking privacy. The implications were clear and alarming. He's running. Looks that way, Carlos confirmed. And he's trying to take as much as he can with him. I'll tell Dominique. We need to move faster. I ended the call and returned to the conference room, where Dominique was still mapping out our strategy on the whiteboard. We have a problem, I announced, relaying what Carlos had told me. Edward's accelerating his timeline. We need to file for emergency orders today, not next week. Dominique's expression hardened. Zurich is a red flag. I'll have my team prepare the emergency filings immediately. But Elizabeth, this changes things. We're no longer working methodically toward a settlement. This is now about preventing Edward from disappearing with assets. What do we need to do? I asked, the gravity of the situation settling over me. Everything, she replied grimly. Freeze accounts, place holds on property transfers, alert financial institutions to potential fraud. And we need to do it all within hours, not days. What followed was a blur of activity. Urgent calls to financial institutions, hasty preparation of legal documents, coordination with Quinn to gather supporting evidence that would stand up in court. Dominique's associates were dispatched to various courthouses across the city, filing emergency motions with a speed that testified to the seriousness of the situation. By mid-afternoon, I was sitting in a judge's chambers alongside Dominique, making our case for emergency injunctions to freeze Edward's assets. Judge Carlton, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with shrewd eyes that seemed to miss nothing, reviewed our hastily assembled documentation with meticulous care. These are serious allegations, Ms. Rivera, she said finally, looking up from the papers. And your evidence, while suggestive, is not conclusive. We understand, Your Honor, Dominique replied. That's why we're only seeking temporary restraining orders until a full hearing can be held. Given Mr. Blackwell's scheduled flight to Switzerland tomorrow, and the substantial financial transfers already in progress, we believe there is legitimate concern about dissipation of marital assets. Judge Carlton turned her attention to me. Mrs. Blackwell, are you aware of the potential consequences if these allegations prove unfounded? Interfering with your husband's legitimate business activities could expose you to significant liability. I met her gaze steadily. I understand, Your Honor. But I also understand what's at stake if we don't act now. The judge studied me for A long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. I'll grant temporary restraining orders on the domestic accounts and properties. But I don't have jurisdiction over the Swiss banking system, Ms. Rivera, as I'm sure you're aware. The domestic freezes will help significantly, Your Honor, Dominique acknowledged. Thank you. As we left the courthouse, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. We had won a partial victory, enough to slow Edward down, but not enough to stop him completely. And in the process, we had abandoned our carefully crafted strategy for a desperate rush to prevent immediate disaster. What happens now? I asked Dominique as we descended the courthouse steps. Now we wait for Edward's reaction, she replied. He'll be notified of the freezes within hours, when he realizes what's happening. She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew that Edward, cornered and desperate, might become truly dangerous. My phone buzzed with a call from Quinn. I just heard from Mary, he said when I answered. The court granted the TROs? Only for the domestic accounts, I confirmed. Not enough to stop him completely. It might be enough to change his plans, Quinn suggested. Force him to delay, regroup, buy us time. Or it might push him to more desperate measures, I countered, voicing the fear that had been growing since we'd learned of Edward's accelerated timeline. Quinn was silent for a moment. Have you heard from Kenna today? The question sent a chill through me. In the rush of emergency filings and court appearances, I hadn't thought to check on her. No. Why? Mary overheard something at the courthouse. Edward's attorney was talking about a troublesome witness who needed to be managed. It might be nothing, but it might be Edward realizing that Kenna was cooperating with me, that she represented a threat to his plans. I'll try to reach her, I promised, ending the call. I dialed the number Carlos had set up for Kenna, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent a text to the same number. Need to talk urgently. Please call. Dominique was watching me with concern. Problem? Maybe, I replied, trying again with the same result. Kenna's not answering. And Quinn heard something concerning about Edward planning to manage a troublesome witness. That could mean many things, Dominique said carefully. Legal witness preparation is often called management. But we both knew Edward's version of management might extend beyond legal boundaries, especially now that he was aware of the court orders, aware that his plans were being actively thwarted. My phone rang, not Kenna, but Carlos. Elizabeth, we've got another issue. The computer monitoring we set up on Edward's devices shows he's been researching one-way flights to countries without extradition treaties. The implication was clear and alarming. He's not just going to London. He's planning to disappear completely. Looks that way, Carlos confirmed. And there's more. He's made multiple calls today to a number associated with a private security firm known for, let's call it, aggressive asset recovery. My blood ran cold. You think he's hiring someone to recover assets? From whom? From anyone he believes. Might be holding them, Carlos replied grimly. Including you, and possibly Kenna. The full dimensions of our failure became clear in that moment. In moving quickly to stop Edward's financial maneuvers, we had pushed him toward more desperate, potentially violent alternatives, and Kenna, who had risked everything to help me, might now be in danger because of it. I need to find her, I said, more to myself than to Carlos. Before Edward does. I've already sent someone to her apartment, Carlos assured me. But she's not there. Neighbors say they heard an argument early this morning, then saw her leave with a suitcase. No one's seen her since. As I ended the call, the weight of our miscalculation pressed down on me. We had underestimated Edward's desperation, his resources, his willingness to escalate. We had thought we were taking the offensive, but in reality, we had merely forced him to reveal how far he was willing to go. And now Kenna was missing, possibly in danger, while Edward was preparing to flee the country with whatever assets he could salvage. Our first major move against Edward had failed, and the consequences were potentially dire. "We need to find her first," I said to Quinn and Carlos as we gathered in my apartment that evening. The atmosphere was tense, the gravity of our situation reflected in their grim expressions. "I've got people checking hotels, transportation hubs," Carlos reported, his laptop open on my kitchen island, multiple windows displaying surveillance feeds and tracking data. "So far, nothing. Either she's lying low somewhere off the grid or—" He didn't complete the sentence. He didn't need to. "Edward's too smart to do anything directly traceable to him," Quinn said, the prosecutor in him analyzing motivations, potential actions. "Especially now, with court orders in place and scrutiny on his movements." "But he's desperate," I countered. "The freezes on his domestic accounts, the restraining orders on property transfers, they've disrupted whatever exit strategy he was planning. And Kenna represents a significant threat to him, especially if she has more evidence we haven't seen yet." Carlos's phone buzzed. He checked the message, his expression shifting. "My contact at the private security firm Edward reached out to says he was looking for asset retrieval and secure transport services. Paid in cash, scheduled for tonight." The implications were clear and chilling. Edward was planning to recover something, or someone, and transport them securely. "Tonight. We need to adapt," I said, a strange calm settling over me despite the urgency of the situation. "We've been reacting to Edward's moves, even when we thought we were being proactive. That ends now." Quinn raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" I moved to the window, looking out at the city lights glimmering against the night sky. "Edward thinks he understands me. He thinks he knows how I'll respond, what resources I have, what I'm willing to do." I turned back to face them. "That's his weakness. He's never really seen me clearly, never understood what I'm capable of." Over the next hour, we developed a new approach, not a defensive posture guarding against Edward's next move, but a genuine, offensive strategy that would force him to respond to us. It was bold, possibly risky, but it played to our strengths while exploiting Edward's growing desperation and overconfidence. First, Carlos would use his contacts to spread information through channels Edward monitored, suggestions that Kenna had secured additional evidence and placed it in a safe deposit box at a specific bank. The goal was to draw Edward's asset retrieval team away from wherever they might be looking for Kenna herself. Second, Quinn would coordinate with Mary to expedite additional court orders targeting Edward's partners at Hansen and Pierce, creating legal complications that would force them to distance themselves from whatever Edward was planning. And finally, I would do something Edward would never expect. I would confront him directly, face to face, at the one location he would feel most secure, his office at Hansen and Pierce. "It's too dangerous," Quinn objected. "Edward is unstable, possibly violent. You can't walk into his territory alone." "I won't be alone," I replied, my voice steady with newfound resolve. "Carlos will have people nearby, and I'll be wearing a recording device. If Edward threatens me, admits to anything illegal, we'll have it documented." "And what exactly do you hope to accomplish by confronting him?" Quinn pressed, his concern evident. "3 things," I said. "First, to keep his attention focused on me, not on finding Kenna. Second, to push him into making mistakes, saying things he shouldn't say. And third," I paused, the plan crystallizing fully in my mind, "to offer him what he wants most right now." Carlos looked up from his laptop. "Which is?" "A way out," I replied simply. "A settlement offer that appears to give him enough to execute his escape plan. One that's too tempting to refuse, even though it's actually a trap." They were both silent, considering the strategy. It was a gamble, undeniably. Edward was intelligent, calculating, and now backed into a corner. But he also had predictable weaknesses. His arrogance, his belief in his own superiority, and most critically, his consistent underestimation of me. "It could work," Carlos admitted finally. "But the timing has to be perfect. The information, About Kenna's supposed safe deposit box needs to reach Edward's security team at exactly the right moment. And the settlement offer needs to seem legitimate, Quinn added. Dominique will have to be involved, create the proper documentation. I nodded. I'll call her now, and then I need to prepare for tomorrow morning. As Quinn and Carlos continued, refining the details of our plan, I stepped into my bedroom to call Dominique. While waiting for her to answer, my gaze fell on a photograph I kept on my nightstand, one of the few personal items I had retrieved from our apartment after Edward changed the locks. It was a picture of my mother and me, taken at her 70th birthday celebration. Her eyes, so like mine, shone with quiet strength and wisdom. "You're stronger than you think, Lizzie," she had told me that night. Looking at her image now, I felt that strength flowing through me, steadying my nerves, clarifying my purpose. Dominique answered on the third ring. "Elizabeth, it's late. Is everything all right?" "No," I replied honestly. "But it's going to be. I need your help with something unusual." As I outlined our strategy, Dominique's initial skepticism gradually transformed into cautious approval. "It's unorthodox," she acknowledged. "But given Edward's accelerated timeline and the danger to Kenna, a conventional approach may no longer be viable. Can you prepare the settlement offer by morning?" I asked. "It needs to look legitimate, comprehensive, but contain the provisions we discussed." "I'll have it ready," she promised. "But Elizabeth, be careful tomorrow. Edward is cornered, and cornered animals are unpredictable." After ending the call, I returned to the living room where Quinn and Carlos were finalizing the logistics of our plan. The atmosphere had shifted, the earlier tension now replaced by focused determination. "Dominique is on board," I announced. "She'll have the settlement documents ready by morning." Carlos looked up from his laptop. "My team will be in position at the bank by 9 a.m. We've spread the information through channels Edward's people are monitoring. They should take the bait." Quinn stood gathering his things. "I'll coordinate with Mary tonight. The additional court orders will be ready first thing tomorrow." As they prepared to leave, Quinn paused at the door. "Are you sure about this, Elizabeth? Once we set this in motion—" "I'm sure," I replied, the certainty in my voice surprising even me. Edward thought he could leave me with nothing. Tomorrow he learns how wrong he was. After they left, I stood, in the quiet of my apartment, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. Tomorrow I would confront Edward on his own territory, would look into the eyes of the man who had betrayed me in the most profound way possible, and I would offer him exactly what he thought he wanted, while setting the stage for his downfall. 4. 12 years, Edward had seen a version of me that suited his purposes, accommodating, deferential, easily managed. Tomorrow he would finally meet the real Elizabeth Turner Blackwell, and nothing between us would ever be the same again. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hanson and Pierce, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the lobby as I strode toward the reception desk. I had chosen my appearance carefully, not the casual clothes Edward had grown accustomed to seeing me in since our separation, but a tailored charcoal suit that projected authority, confidence, and most importantly, control. "I'm here to see Edward Blackwell," I told the receptionist, a young woman I didn't recognize from my previous visits to the firm. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her fingers poised over her keyboard. "No," I replied calmly. "But he'll see me. I'm his wife." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly at this, no doubt recognizing the name Blackwell, and perhaps aware of the rumors that had been circulating about Edward's personal and professional situation. "One moment, please," she said, picking up her phone. From the corner of my eye, I spotted Ashton Pierce emerging from the elevator bank, his expression shifting from distraction to alarm when he saw me standing in the lobby. Edward's attorney quickened his pace, intercepting me before the receptionist could complete her call. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, his voice low and tense. "This is highly irregular. Any communication should go through proper legal channels. I met his gaze steadily. I have a settlement proposal for Edward, one that can't wait for legal channels. Ashton's eyes narrowed. If you have a proposal, you should submit it to me first. The proposal is time-sensitive, I replied, removing an envelope from my purse, the settlement documents Dominique had prepared overnight. And frankly, Ashton, given recent events, I think Edward will want to hear this directly from me. The reference to recent events had the intended effect. Ashton's posture stiffened, his expression betraying momentary uncertainty. The court orders freezing Edward's assets, the expedited hearings scheduled for later that week. These had created complications that threatened to entangle not just Edward, but potentially the firm itself. Wait here, he said finally, taking the envelope. I'll see if Edward is available. As Ashton disappeared toward the elevators, I checked my watch. 9:15. By now, Carlos's team should be in position at the bank where we had planted information about Kenna's supposed safe deposit box. The diversion was designed to draw away whatever asset recovery personnel Edward had hired, keeping Kenna, wherever she was, safer than she would be otherwise. My phone vibrated with a text from Quinn. Additional orders granted. Partners. Being served now. Perfect timing. Just as Edward was deciding whether to see me, his partners would be receiving court documents that named them as persons of interest in our case, creating immediate pressure for them to distance themselves from Edward's activities. 15 minutes later, Ashton returned, his expression unreadable. Edward will see you, briefly. He escorted me to the elevator, the ride to the 42nd floor passing in tense silence. As we walked through the executive floor toward Edward's corner office, I was aware of the curious glances from associates and staff, the hushed conversations that halted as we passed. Word was spreading quickly. Edward's office was exactly as I remembered it, expansive, meticulously organized, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Manhattan. Edward himself stood behind his desk, his posture rigid, his expression a careful mask of professional detachment. "This is highly inappropriate, Elizabeth," he said, as Ashton closed the door behind me. "Ambushing me at my office." "Is it an ambush? To face your husband directly?" I asked, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. "To offer a solution to the situation you've created?" Edward remained standing, maintaining the physical advantage of height. "Ashton says you have a settlement proposal, one that's supposedly time-sensitive." "It is," I confirmed, "because I know about your plans, Edward. The flight to Zurich, the research into non-extradition countries, the asset recovery team you hired for tonight." The momentary flicker in his eyes confirmed that my information was accurate, though he quickly recovered his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," I said calmly. "Just as you know that your domestic accounts are frozen, your property transfers blocked, and as of this morning, your partners are being questioned about their knowledge of Project Titanium." At the mention of Project Titanium, Edward's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. He glanced toward the door, perhaps concerned that our conversation might be overheard. "What exactly do you want, Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice lower, more controlled. "The same thing you want," I replied. "A clean resolution, an end to this situation before it damages both of us beyond repair." Edward's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And you're suddenly willing to be reasonable? After filing emergency orders? Freezing my accounts? After involving my partners in our private dispute?" "I'm willing to be practical," I corrected him. "The settlement offer in that envelope provides you with enough liquidity to move forward with your plans. In exchange, you drop all claims to my separate assets and agree to a non-disclosure agreement regarding our marriage and divorce." Edward studied me for a long moment, clearly trying to determine what angle I was playing, what trap might be hidden in my unexpected reasonableness. "Why now? What's changed?" Here was the delicate part of our strategy, offering an explanation that would appeal to Edward's ego while concealing my true motives. "I'm tired, Edward," I said, allowing genuine weariness to color my voice. Tired? Of fighting. Tired of the public spectacle this is becoming. My mother always valued privacy, dignity. This circus would have horrified her. It was a calculated appeal to what Edward knew of my relationship with my mother, to values he had seen me demonstrate throughout our marriage. And importantly, it positioned my offer as coming from a place of emotional exhaustion rather than strategic calculation. Exactly the kind of feminine weakness Edward would find plausible. He picked up the envelope, removing the settlement, documents and scanning them with the rapid efficiency that had made him such an effective corporate attorney. I watched his face carefully, noting the moment when he reached the key provisions, the release of specific accounts from the court-ordered freeze, the accelerated timeline for transfer of assets, the mutual non-disparagement clauses. "This is more reasonable than I expected," he admitted finally, setting the papers down. "But there's a significant gap between signing these documents and having the court orders actually lifted. Dominique has prepared the necessary motions to vacate the emergency orders," I assured him. "They can be filed immediately upon execution of the settlement agreement." Edward moved to the window, looking out over the city as he considered my offer. I knew what calculations were running through his mind. How much the settlement would give him versus what he might eventually secure through protracted litigation, whether the accelerated timeline aligned with his plans for departure, what hidden angles I might be working that he hadn't identified yet. "What about Kenna?" he asked suddenly, turning back to face me. The question caught me off guard. "What about her? Is she part of this arrangement?" This sudden desire for a clean resolution? I maintained a neutral expression, though internally I was alarmed by the implication of his question. "Kenna is your concern, not mine. This settlement is between you and me." Edward's smile was cold, calculating. "You've spoken with her. You know she's been unreliable recently, emotional, making accusations." I chose my next words carefully, aware of the recording device concealed in my purse. "I know she's afraid, Edward, and I think we both know she has reason to be." Edward's eyes narrowed at my words, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. For a moment the mask slipped, the calculated charm, the careful control, revealing something harder, colder beneath. "Are you threatening me, Elizabeth?" His voice was soft, dangerous. "No," I replied evenly. "I'm acknowledging reality. Kenna is afraid because she's seen sides of you that I recognize all too well." He moved away from the window, circling his desk with the deliberate movements of a predator. "You think you understand the situation. You think your cousin and your lawyer and whoever else you've enlisted have given you some sort of advantage?" He leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." I met his gaze without flinching. "I think I do, Edward. Project Titanium, the offshore accounts, the systematic manipulation of investment valuations for Hansen and Pierce clients. I understand more than you realize." His composure fractured further, surprise and alarm flashing across his face before he could suppress them. "You're bluffing. You couldn't possibly have documentation," I finished for him. "Evidence that would interest not just divorce courts but federal prosecutors? You taught me the importance of thorough preparation, Edward. It's one of the few valuable lessons from our marriage." He straightened, reassessing me with new eyes, no longer seeing the accommodating wife he had shaped over years, but a formidable opponent who had been several steps ahead of him all along. "What exactly do you want?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Exactly what's in that settlement agreement. No more, no less." I stood, smoothing my suit jacket with deliberate calm. "You sign, you get enough assets to start over somewhere else, and we both agree never to speak of each other again. It's a clean break, Edward. Cleaner than you deserve." For a long moment, he was silent, calculating options, risks, potential, angles. Then he reached for the papers, flipping to the signature page. "I'll need to have Ashton review these." "Of course," I agreed. "But I'll need your answer by the end of the day. After that, the offer expires, and those documents I mentioned find their way to people who would be very interested in their contents." As I turned to leave, Edward's voice stopped me, different now, less commanding, almost tentative. "How did you do it? All these years, I thought I knew you completely." I looked back at him, at the man I had once believed was the center of my world, now revealed as someone I had never truly known at all. "That was your mistake, Edward. You saw what you wanted to see. You never bothered to look deeper." The walk back through the executive floor felt surreal, like moving through a world I had once been part of, but now viewed from a strange distance. Ashton was waiting near the elevators, his expression conveying professional concern. "Did you and Edward reach an understanding?" he asked, escorting me toward the lobby. "We did," I replied. "He has the settlement offer. I expect you'll be reviewing it shortly." As I stepped into the elevator, Ashton hesitated, then spoke in a lowered voice. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Blackwell, not everyone at the firm was aware of Edward's methods. Some of us are just learning the extent of certain situations." The carefully chosen words suggested that Edward's partners were indeed distancing themselves, preparing for damage control as Quinn's additional court orders took effect, another piece of our strategy falling into place. Outside Hanson and Pierce, the spring morning had brightened, sunshine warming the city streets. I texted Carlos. "Meeting complete, heading to rendezvous point." His response came immediately. "Bank operation successful. Diversion worked. Proceed to secondary location." My pulse quickened. If the bank operation had been successful, it meant Edward's asset recovery team had taken our bait, attempting to access a safe deposit box that didn't exist. More importantly, it meant they weren't looking for Kenna elsewhere. 30 minutes. Later, I entered the small coffee shop in the West Village where Carlos had arranged our meeting. He was already there, seated at a corner table with a woman whose honey blonde hair was now dyed a rich auburn, cut in a short style that changed her appearance dramatically. "Kenna," I said, relief washing over me as I slid into the chair across from her. "You're safe." She nodded, her eyes revealing both fear and determination. "Thanks to Mr. Mendoza. He found me just as I was leaving my friend's apartment last night. Said it wasn't safe to go home." Carlos nodded. "Edward's people were watching her building. If she'd stayed there or returned to her own apartment." He didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood the risk Kenna had faced once Edward realized she was cooperating with me. "Edward asked about you," I told her. "During our meeting, he seemed concerned about your whereabouts. Concerned for himself, not for me," Kenna replied with unexpected bitterness. "Did he take the settlement offer?" "He's reviewing it with his attorney," I said. "But I think he will. It appears to give him what he needs most right now. Enough liquid assets to execute his escape plan." Carlos leaned forward. "What he doesn't realize is that accepting the settlement triggers the monitoring protocols we've established with financial institutions. The moment he attempts to transfer funds, internationally, federal authorities will be notified. It was the hidden trap in our seemingly generous offer. Edward would gain access to funds, but those very funds would be flagged for monitoring, creating a legal trail that would follow him regardless of where he fled." "And the evidence about Project Titanium?" Kenna asked. "The documents I gave you?" "Secure," I assured her. "Quinn has arranged for them to be held by a trusted third party. If Edward honors the settlement, they remain sealed. If not, they go to the SEC and the district attorney's office," Carlos finished. Kenna nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. For the first time since I'd entered the coffee shop. "What happens to me now?" Edward knows I've helped you. He won't forget that. It was the question we had anticipated, had prepared for as part of our adapted strategy. You have options, I told her. Carlos has contacts who can help you relocate, establish a new identity if necessary. Alternatively, you could cooperate formally with authorities as they investigate Project Titanium, potentially with whistleblower protections. Or, Carlos added, once Edward is focused on his own escape, you might be able to resume your life with appropriate security measures in place. It depends on how this plays out over the next few days. Kenna considered these options, her expression thoughtful. I never thought it would come to this. When I met Edward, he seemed so perfect, successful, charming, attentive. I never imagined I'd end up hiding in a coffee shop with dyed hair, afraid for my safety. The vulnerability in her voice struck a chord within me, the echo of my own disillusionment, my own gradual awakening to Edward's true nature. In that moment, looking at this young woman whose life had been upended by the same man who had betrayed me, I felt something unexpected, a sense of purpose, of responsibility that extended beyond my own situation. Whatever you decide, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand, you won't face it alone. Edward isolated both of us, made us feel dependent on him, but we're stronger than he ever gave us credit for, especially together. As we continued discussing practical arrangements for Kenna's immediate safety, my phone buzzed with a text from Dominique. Edward's attorney called. They're ready to sign the settlement. Meeting set for 4 p.m. today. The final piece falling into place. Edward had taken the bait, believing he had found a path to escape the consequences of his actions. Little did he know, he was walking directly into a trap of our own making. I showed the text to Carlos, whose expression remained professionally neutral, even as his eyes conveyed satisfaction at our plan's progress. It's happening, I said, a strange calm settling over me despite the high stakes of our strategy. By this time tomorrow it will be over. Kenna looked between us, hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. Do you really believe that? That someone like Edward can actually be held accountable? It was the question at the heart of everything. Whether power and privilege could truly be overcome by truth and justice. Whether a man who had manipulated the system for so long could finally face consequences for his actions. Yes, I said, with quiet conviction. Because for once, Edward has underestimated everyone around him, and that will be his final mistake. The hours before the settlement meeting stretched before me like a tightrope, a narrow path that required perfect balance, unwavering focus, and absolute precision. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, and everything we had worked for could collapse. I returned to my apartment to prepare, knowing that the final confrontation with Edward would demand every ounce of composure I possessed. Carlos had arranged for a security team to monitor the building discreetly, while Quinn coordinated with Dominique on the final legal details of our strategy. Standing in my bedroom, I opened the closet and removed the outfit I had selected for this pivotal moment. Not another power suit like the one I'd worn to Edward's office that morning, but a dress my mother had given me for my 41st birthday. Elegant but understated, in a deep blue that she had always said brought out the strength in my eyes. Wear this when you need to remember who you are, she had told me, her intuition perhaps sensing the challenges that lay ahead in my marriage, even before I was willing to acknowledge them. As I changed, my phone rang. Mary, Quinn's wife, and the family court judge whose guidance had been invaluable throughout this ordeal. Elizabeth, she said when I answered, her voice warm but concerned. Quinn told me about today's developments. Are you certain about this approach? The question wasn't surprising coming from Mary, whose judicial temperament always led her to question whether confrontation was truly necessary, whether reconciliation might still be possible. I'm certain, I replied, my voice steadier than I had expected. Edward has left no other path forward. Mary was silent for a moment. I've seen many divorces in my courtroom, Elizabeth. Many betrayals, many acts of cruelty disguised as legal maneuvering. But what Edward has done, emptying your accounts while you were at your mother's deathbed, planning to disappear with your joint assets, potentially threatening Kenna's safety, it crosses lines that can't be uncrossed. I know, I said softly. What I'm trying to say, Mary continued, is that you shouldn't feel guilty about what happens next, about the consequences Edward will face. Those are the result of his choices, not yours. Her words touched something deep within me, a lingering doubt, a whisper of the old programming that had led me to protect Edward, to make excuses for his behavior, to shoulder responsibility for his actions. Thank you, I said, grateful for her perception, for naming the conflict I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself. After we hung up, I continued my preparations, gathering the documents I would need, reviewing the key points Dominique had outlined. This meeting wasn't just about signing papers. It was about maintaining the delicate illusion that would lead Edward to walk willingly into the accountability he had spent years evading. At 3:30, a text arrived from Carlos. All systems go. Security in place at the law office. Quinn. And Dominique already there. I took one final look in the mirror, at the woman who had emerged from the chrysalis of a controlling marriage, who had found strength in the very crisis that was meant to destroy her. The woman my mother had always seen, even when I couldn't see her myself. The taxi ride to Dominique's office felt surreal, the city passing by in a blur of spring sunshine and shadows. I focused on my breathing, on the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, on the clarity that had come with understanding exactly who Edward was and who I had become in response. Dominique's assistant greeted me in the reception area, leading me not to her usual conference room but to a larger space on the same floor, a room I had never seen before, with a long mahogany table and chairs arranged on either side. Ms. Rivera thought a neutral setting would be appropriate, the assistant explained, showing me to a chair on the far side of the table. Mr. Blackwell and Mr. Pierce have not arrived yet, but Ms. Rivera and Mr. Rodriguez are waiting for you in her office. Would you like to join them? I shook my head. I'll wait here, thank you. Being alone in the room where everything would be resolved gave me a moment to center myself, to prepare for Edward's arrival. I arranged my documents precisely, adjusted my chair to ensure I would be sitting at eye level with him, considered the exact words I would use and those I would avoid. Control had always been Edward's weapon of choice, wielded subtly through manipulation, gaslighting, financial domination. Today, that control would be turned inside out, revealing itself as the illusion it had always been. At precisely 4 o'clock, the conference room door opened. Dominique entered first, her expression professionally neutral though her eyes conveyed support as they met mine. Quinn followed, taking a position at the side of the room where he could observe without being directly involved in the negotiations. Then came Ashton Pierce, his customary confidence somewhat diminished, his posture betraying the strain of recent developments. And finally, Edward, impeccably dressed as always, his expression carefully composed, though I detected the tension around his eyes, the slight rigidity in his movements that signaled his awareness of the precariousness of his position. Elizabeth, he acknowledged with a slight nod, taking the seat directly across from me. Edward, I replied, my voice calm, controlled. Dominique took charge immediately, her commanding presence filling the room as she outlined the parameters of our meeting. We're here to finalize the settlement agreement between Elizabeth Turner Blackwell and Edward James Blackwell. Both parties have reviewed the documents with counsel and are prepared to execute them today. Is that correct? Ashton nodded. It is. Yes, I confirmed. Edward remained silent, his eyes never leaving my face, searching for some clue to my motivations, some hint of what might lie beneath the surface of this unexpectedly amicable resolution. Dominique distributed copies of the final agreement, identical to what Edward had reviewed that morning, with minor technical adjustments that Ashton had requested. As Edward and his attorney examined the documents one final time, I maintained perfect stillness, offering nothing for Edward to read, to analyze, to exploit. "The terms appear to be in order," Ashton said finally, looking to Edward for confirmation. Edward nodded, his pen poised over the signature line, but his eyes still fixed on me. "Before we proceed, I'd like a moment alone with Elizabeth." The request hung in the air, unexpected despite our anticipation of potential last-minute maneuvers. Dominique glanced at me, a question in her eyes. "It's fine," I assured her. 5 minutes. Dominique looked skeptical but nodded. "We'll be right outside." As the others filed out of the room, leaving Edward and me alone, I prepared for whatever tactic he might employ. Charm, intimidation, perhaps even a genuine attempt at reconciliation. With Edward, the line between authentic emotion and calculated performance had always been impossibly blurred. He waited until the door closed behind them, then set down his pen with deliberate precision. "You've surprised me, Elizabeth. I wouldn't have thought you capable of this level of strategic thinking." "There are many things you never thought me capable of," I replied evenly. "That was always your blind spot." A faint smile played at the corner of his mouth, not warm, not genuine, but appreciative in the way one professional might acknowledge another's skill. "Indeed. But I'm curious about one thing." "What's that?" "Why this settlement? Why not pursue the scorched earth approach? Quinn and Dominique were clearly preparing. You had enough ammunition, between Kenna's cooperation and whatever financial records your cousin uncovered. It was the question we had anticipated, the one our entire strategy hinged upon. Edward's need to understand, to feel he had grasped all the angles, would be his undoing. Because this gives us both what we need, Edward," I said, the careful script we had prepared flowing naturally. "You get the liquidity for your fresh start elsewhere. I get closure, privacy, and the satisfaction of knowing our marriage is definitively over." He studied me, skepticism evident in his expression. "That simple? After everything that's happened?" "Not simple," I corrected him. "Necessary. I'm tired, Edward. Tired of fighting, tired of dwelling in the past, tired of allowing your betrayal to consume any more of my life than it already has." Something shifted in his gaze, a recognition, perhaps, of the truth beneath my words. For all our strategic calculations, this core sentiment was genuine. I was tired. Tired of Edward's manipulations, tired of the emotional and mental energy his betrayal had demanded. "And Kenna?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Is not my concern," I replied. "What happens between you and her is your business, as long as it doesn't violate the terms of our agreement." He nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with my response. "Then let's finish this." Edward picked up his pen again, signing the agreement with the confident flourish I had seen countless times over. Our years together, on checks, contracts, birthday cards, the mortgage for our penthouse. The signature of a man accustomed to having his decisions carry weight, to having documents transform reality according to his will. If only he knew that this particular signature was rewriting reality in ways he hadn't anticipated, setting in motion consequences he could not control. I signed my own name beneath his, the finality of the act bringing not grief or regret, but a profound sense of liberation. When I looked up, Edward was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something between admiration and wariness, between recognition and loss. "It's done then," he said quietly. "Yes," I agreed, collecting my copy of the agreement. "It's done." The next 48 hours unfolded with the inexorable precision of a well-crafted timepiece, each movement triggering the next in a sequence that Edward, despite all his planning, never saw coming. As Dominique had predicted, Edward acted quickly once the settlement was signed. Within hours, he had contacted the financial institutions where his newly unfrozen accounts were held. initiating the transfers that would fund his escape. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that these very actions were being monitored not just by Carlos's team, but by federal authorities who had been quietly briefed on potential financial irregularities connected to Project Titanium. I remained in my apartment during this time, receiving regular updates from Quinn and Carlos, watching from a distance as Edward maneuvered what he believed was his clean escape. The pattern of his movements was exactly as we had anticipated, methodical, calculated, focused on tying up loose ends before his departure, until everything changed. The call came from Quinn at 6:17 a.m. on the second day after our settlement meeting. I was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city come to life in the early morning light. "It's happening," Quinn said without preamble. Federal agents just took Edward into custody at JFK. He was attempting to board a flight to Dubai. Dubai. Not London, after all. A non-extradition country, just as Carlos had suspected. "The transfers?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Flagged and frozen," Quinn confirmed. "All of them. And the search warrant for his office at Hanson. And Pierce is being executed as we speak." I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the reality of what was happening. For all our planning, for all our strategic calculations, there was something sobering about knowing that Edward was now facing not just the end of our marriage, but potentially the end of his freedom, his career, everything he had built. "Elizabeth?" Quinn's voice brought me back to the moment. "Are you okay?" It was a complicated question. Was I okay knowing that the man I had once loved, had built a life with, was now in federal custody? Was I okay with the role I had played in bringing him to this point? "Yes," I said finally, the word carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I'm okay." And I was. Not triumphant, not vindictive, but at peace with the knowledge that justice, real justice, was finally being served. Edward had made his choices, had betrayed not just me but his partners, his clients, the very laws he had sworn to uphold as an attorney. The consequences he now faced were of his own making. "What about Kenna?" I asked, thinking of the young woman whose courage had been instrumental in bringing the truth to light. "Safe," Quinn assured me. "Mary has arranged protective custody until we know the full extent of the charges against Edward. After that, the U.S. Attorney's Office has indicated they might be interested in formal whistleblower status for her." I hung up. I remained by the window, watching the sun rise fully over Manhattan, casting the city in a golden light that seemed symbolic of the clarity that had finally arrived after months of darkness and uncertainty. Edward had sought to leave me with nothing. Instead, he had left me with something invaluable: the knowledge of my own strength, my own resilience, my own capacity to stand firm in the face of betrayal and cruelty. It was not the ending I would have chosen for our story when I had walked down the aisle 12 years earlier, full of hope and love and optimism. But it was the ending that justice demanded. 3 months after Edward's arrest, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching a summer storm roll across the city. The air was heavy with anticipation, charged with the electricity of approaching thunder. A perfect metaphor for the transformation my life had undergone since that rainy spring morning when I had discovered our accounts emptied. Edward's case had moved with unexpected swiftness through the federal justice system, the evidence against him so substantial that his attorneys had quickly pivoted from declarations of innocence to negotiations for leniency. Project Titanium, it emerged, had been a sophisticated scheme to manipulate investment valuations for Hanson and Pierce's most elite clients, creating artificial profits while skimming millions into offshore accounts. The settlement agreement Edward had signed, the one he believed would facilitate his escape, had instead created the legal framework that ensured these ill-gotten gains would be returned to their rightful owners, with a substantial portion set aside for those who had been unwittingly harmed by his actions. Hansen and Pierce itself was undergoing a painful restructuring. Several partners forced to resign as their knowledge of or complicity in Edward's activities came to light. Ashton Pierce, to his credit, had cooperated fully with investigators, apparently genuinely unaware of the full extent of Edward's financial manipulations. My phone buzzed with a text from Kenna. "Just finished at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Official whistleblower status confirmed. Would love to meet for coffee next week if you're free." I smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. Kenna's journey had paralleled my own in many ways, from victim to witness to advocate. Her testimony had been crucial in building the case against Edward, her courage in coming forward, providing a model for others within the firm who had observed irregularities, but remained silent. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my reflections. Quinn and Mary stood in the hallway, carrying bottles of champagne and bearing wide smiles. "It's official," Quinn announced as I let them in. "The court approved the final distribution plan this morning. Every penny Edward tried to hide has been accounted for, with interest." Mary set the champagne on the kitchen counter, reaching for glasses. "And more importantly, you are officially, completely, irrevocably divorced. The judge signed the decree an hour ago." I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, not grief or regret, but a profound sense of closure, of chapters ending and beginning, simultaneously. The woman who had signed a prenuptial agreement 12 years ago, who had gradually diminished herself to accommodate Edward's growing ego and control, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, clearer, more authentically herself than she had been in years. As Quinn opened the champagne, the cork popping with a celebratory flourish, Dominique called to share the news I'd already heard from Mary, her satisfaction evident even through the professional tone she maintained. "One more thing," she added before hanging up. "The Foundation Board voted unanimously this morning. You're officially the new executive director starting next month." The Children's Literacy Foundation, where I had volunteered for years, where Edward had first approached me with that calculated charm, was now entrusting me with its leadership. A full-circle moment that represented not just professional validation, but personal reclamation. As we raised our glasses in toast, rain began to fall outside, steady and cleansing. I thought of my mother, of what she might say if she could see me now. "Life is too short to become less than who you are," she had told me in her final months. Looking at the faces of those who had supported me through the darkest period of my life, Quinn, Mary, Dominique, even Kenna, I knew I had finally honored that wisdom. Edward had emptied our accounts, had attempted to leave me with nothing. Instead, he had inadvertently set me on the path to reclaiming everything: my financial security, my self-respect, my future. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the city in brilliant flashes. But within my apartment, within myself, there was only clarity and calm. The kind of peace that comes not from absence of conflict, but from having weathered it and emerged stronger. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.